Welcome to Groundwater Rising. This podcast is all about flooding, with a focus on the forgotten source of flooding, groundwater flooding. Groundwater flooding is the least understood, least monitored, and least reported on. It is often left out of the conversation, so we are a podcast dedicated to changing that. I'm Casey Hargrove-Smith from Project Groundwater, and in this podcast I'll be speaking to community members from around the UK who have to deal with groundwater flooding and industry experts trying to help them. Together, we will uncover the latest research, innovation and strategies from the water sector, academia and beyond. Today's episode is a little different from what you're used to. After almost 2 years behind the mic, I'll be handing things over to a new voice. Starting with February's episode, Helen will be your new host. She brings a fresh perspective and a cheerful energy that I know you're going to love. Groundwater Rising will keep its same schedule and focus, shining a spotlight on groundwater flooding while discussing interesting topics from throughout the industry. In this episode, we'll get to know Helen, put her in the guest seat, and who knows, she might even turn the tables on me. Helen, welcome to Groundwater Rising.
Hi Katie, thank you for having me. This is a strange experience, isn't it?
It is a little bit odd for me, but why don't we start with you introducing yourself?
I'm Helen. I have been involved in FCRIP projects for a couple of years now. I work with another project in the Slough area, Project Sponge, and I've just joined you guys over here in Project Groundwater. For me, I come from a slightly different background. Best part of 30 years working in advertising and marketing and branding, so it's a completely different perspective, and then that I think will give me a fresh take on what we're going to be discussing on this podcast as well.
Have you ever done podcasts before?
I've been a guest on podcasts, but I've never hosted them. Being able to sit and chat in a podcast, I think, is a really lovely approach. That's certainly something that comes across in the podcast that you've been doing with your guests, so people actually get to chat about what they are interested in and what they love. That is what keeps these things so intriguing for people to listen to.
So how does this align with what you're working on at the moment?
The focus in the good stuff and the work that we do with brands and with businesses, and we do a lot of work with charities, but it's on working with people who want to do good work for good reasons. So it's good people, good work, good reasons, and that brings us to working in an environment where the voice of the audience is really, really important. So for me, it's about representing like residents, flooded people who have maybe no understanding of what's going on around them in terms of the environmental changes and the impact that they can have. But it's that real focus on people and what matters and their values and bringing that to the forefront that I find really interesting. And that's why it kind of aligns with where we are. Working on Project Sponge as well has given me a bit of insight. What I find really quite interesting isn't even the right word, but I suppose it's been quite a shock actually. What works in some areas doesn't work in others. So understanding how different people tick, different communities tick, how different people respond to different engagement, different communications, that's really, really interesting. And that's where, we spend a lot of our time really digging into what makes people tick, I suppose.
And just to clarify, so FCRIP is the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme that funds many of the projects that Helen and I work on, and the Good Stuff is your company, because you didn't mention the Good Stuff earlier, so the Good Stuff is your company.
Yeah, the business that I run with my co-founder, James Easley, we're called The Good Stuff because, it is all about focusing on not only the good stuff in terms of what we want to achieve, but also the good stuff in terms of what we want to get out of businesses and brands and people. It's digging much deeper than you normally would. So we quite often use this phrase. It's actually a Dolly Parton phrase, because I don't know how many of you realise what a great brand strategist she is, but we like to use the phrase, find out who you are and do it on purpose. Find out exactly what you're trying to achieve, who you want to impact, what effect you want to have on their lives, but also their environment, and stick to it.
And you mentioned earlier how every place is different and every interaction that you have has to be different. And I think that's something that's very particular when you're working with flooded people, is no one's going to react the same, and it's a horrifically traumatic experience for many people, and so there's got to be a level of sensitivity, but also we want these conversations, we want to have them, and learning how you speak to people, that's like a very specific skill that I think you can only learn by doing.
Yeah, I was really quite naive to that, I think, when I came in. I've never been flooded. It's not, it's not an experience I've had. Some of the conversations I've had over the last couple of years have been really enlightening, just to understand the impact. Someone said to me a little while ago, they're in an area that is sort of notorious for flooding. When the heavy rains start, the anxiety levels rise. And to me, that felt really sad, because I'm one of those people where I love to hear the rain. That actually really hit me. And it's things like that, yeah, to me, that's something that you wouldn't know unless you were speaking to somebody who's been in that position. And other people won't know. So, if you're in an area looking at the project areas of focus, there are bits of that where people will never really know what it means to be flooded. It doesn't impact on them at all. So we need to get those voices out and those stories out and those messages out, but in a really respectful way, because, these are people's lives.
Yeah, and that one is really interesting because you're right, because that's one of the most famous relaxing sounds. So you just wouldn't know if you weren't told. And I think everyone in the industry will have that one conversation that they've had with someone who's been flooded that just really sticks with them. I think I mentioned on one of the previous episodes that I had a conversation with someone where even a year after her family was flooded, she was sleeping every night in her actual clothes, ready to wake up and go. And she just mentioned it really casually, like it was just a general part of her day now. And I was like, that's terrifying that is the impact that being flooded has had on someone. And a year later, it's still at that level of deep anxiety. That's why I was very keen to do a podcast on this and have the opportunity for people to come on and talk about these stories if they're comfortable. It's because I think there's not enough. If you don't know, you don't know, but you do need to have these opportunities to listen and to hear. And this podcast does provide that.
Have you found it easy to get people to talk about their personal experiences on here?
No, so it's much harder because it is deeply personal and often has a big impact on mental health, and famously mental health is something that people really struggle to talk about. And I've had people come on and they'll talk about it in a very serious way, but they won't necessarily go into the personal impact. They'll be like, yeah, this happened and here's the physical things that happened to me. But they'll be less likely to go into and this is the emotional impact it has. And I've spoken to many people on screen and off screen. Sometimes if you just continue the conversation, suddenly something will come out and you'll be like, oh. So you kind of leave the space for them to talk. But it is a much harder one. But it is a hope that I have for the future of the podcast, that more people will come forward and share their stories. What do you think your approach is going to be when you take over as host?
I'm very honest, Katie. We're not replacing you and your wonderful knowledge with somebody who has similar wonderful knowledge. So from my perspective, I love to ask questions. I love to be the stupid one in the room. I have no shame. I've been doing it for years. Ask the questions that people want to know and dig as deep as possible to get to that human connection. So I think that will be my take. I will want to understand a lot about the concepts and the approaches and maybe some of those technical terms in a way that would impact me as a resident, as an individual, and see what that means and see how that feels. So I'll be a sponge and absorb as much as I can, but yeah, it's definitely going to be, okay, how does that affect people? What does that mean? How does that feel? So yeah, expect a lot of stupid questions in a good way.
I think we can stick to those no stupid questions, because you'll be asking the questions that everyone else will be listening going, we get experts on who know very technical information, and often I'll be sat there like, oh no, I don't think I fully understand. But then that's good, because if I didn't fully understand, probably a lot of people who are listening didn't fully understand. And so that, I think, is always the benefit of having a non-technical host for a technical podcast, because it gets you both the technical information and that simpler, easier to understand for everybody. So you can still understand the complexities of groundwater flooding without having to be the technical expert.
But if you challenge me to ask a stupid question every month, then I'll try.
I think you should do it. This is like your one wild question per episode. It's like, how out there can I get?
That's exactly how we will frame this going forward. Thank you.
And who would be a dream guest to have on the podcast?
The first person that comes to mind is nothing to do with flooding. But if I could have a conversation with somebody like Bob Mortimer, who could add a completely different layer of understanding to any situation with humour. But also, I think, Bob has a great appreciation for nature and for water. At this stage, I obviously need to dig deep into the topics that we've covered and where those gaps are. And I know that there are a lot of things that are still to be covered in this podcast, so we'll be looking at those. But yeah, if I was to pick a real fantasy guest just for fun, it would be somebody like Bob. What's been your favourite episode?
The ones that I'm most proud of, which I will there say for are my favourite, have been the insurance and the renters one, because I think those ones were very much targeted at people, and they're covering topics that I think aren't spoken about enough. Like, we all know we should have flood insurance, but with groundwater flooding, the fact that not all of your flood insurance covers it, and so people get flooded and then suddenly discover they're not insured, that's like a really bad thing that could really impact someone like way worse than they need to be during an already terrible time. So I think getting that out there and talking about topics that are interesting, and like renting and flood risk, I think is a massive gap. Landlords have basically no responsibility to tell you that you're going to be flooded or that there's any risks, to provide any form of resilience measures. They only need to maybe give you back some rent money if you get flooded, something so minimal during a time of like massive impact on you. And so I think those topics I was very keen to get out there and talk to people about and like have it in the ether. But then equally I also loved, funny enough, the first ever episode that was on resilience, because from a personal point of view I love taking it like a word and just picking it apart. Like, what does this word actually mean? Because language is so incredibly important. Even the slight change of a word in a sentence will have a massive impact, and it really changes. And I think we should be intentional with language and all that. So I started off my very first episode just being like, this is great, I just get to talk about this one word with two experts who've been researching that, and I had a really good time.
Especially resilience, I mean, it is just a word, but it's one of the most important words that we're dealing with in the project, isn't it? And it means so many different things to different people. I think that's what really struck me. You can't just say to someone, be resilient. They have to be shown the skills, and that's why they're teaching it at primary schools. They're teaching them what they have to do to be resilient, what it means, why they have to do that. And when you say to a community, well, it's about being resilient, you can't do it without supporting them through it, without giving them the skills, helping them see what that means. So yeah, I really enjoyed that episode, and I can see why you did as well. What are the things that you wish you'd have been able to cover but haven't been able to? And what are the gaps for you?
There's an episode that I really would like to do and has been sort of hanging around in the ether, and it will hopefully come to fruition at some point, but the relationship between abstraction and groundwater flooding, I think it's a really interesting one. Abstraction is really bad in chalk areas, chalk catchments, because the chalk streams rely on the groundwater to feed them, and they are incredibly important features of our landscape. I think something like over 80% of the chalk streams in the world are in the UK. Like, they're stunning, they're full of biodiversity, we love them. And abstraction is removing that water that's feeding these chalk streams, and that is bad. But equally, there is an element of, we've been extracting for so long that we have probably impacted the way that groundwater runs, and that we are reducing these streams from running as often. And so there's an element of actually abstraction has possibly supported the reduction of groundwater flooding. So where do we draw that line in that relationship between preventing groundwater flooding but ensuring that we support a very important part of our environment? It's not even just because it's beautiful and it's important. There's also an element of nature has its cycles and we need to support them, because actually that has a wider impact. So we would be protecting people by restoring chalk streams, and potentially other forms of flood risk could be reduced. Maybe not groundwater flood risk, but other forms. However, there's that balance that needs to be struck between, like, how much do we abstract, when do we abstract, like, and it's a big topic and it's very difficult, and I do not know the answers to it, but I think that would be a really interesting one to kind of dig into and have guests on who do know the answers that I don't know and could come on and do that. And if you do get that episode out, I will be tuning in immediately.
That will be happening, you have my word. So where are you off to next, Katie? What's your next challenge?
So yeah, the reason we're changing hosts is because I'm changing roles. So I'm leaving Project Groundwater and I'm moving to Oxfordshire County Council, where I'm going into their flood risk management team to be a flood risk management officer. So it's a bit different for me. So my day job on the project is more to do with the communications and engagement, and I do love that. But I come from a more environmental background, and so I'm quite keen to go move into something that gives me more to learn the actual like technical side of flooding, and I'll learn a lot more that way, which I like a challenge, and I like learning, partly why I love being on this podcast. So I think it will be a bit of a challenge for me to learn those new skills, but there's hopefully still going to be an element of community engagement and working with people that I'm really excited about as well. But I am very sad to be leaving the podcast.
Does that mean that you will somehow find a way to start a podcast in your new role?
Maybe I'll convince them. And I think what I've learned doing this is actually, it's not too hard to do a podcast. Like, it is hard and there are skills involved, and I get fantastic support on this podcast, and we've got an amazing podcast producer and editor who does all the hard bits for me, Andy from Bulb. But if I wanted to do a podcast in the future, I do think I could, and I would have to upskill a little bit on terms of like some editing work. But actually, if you've got a really interesting topic, even just using your phone mic, you can make a podcast. and you can make a good podcast as long as like the topic you have is interesting and people want to listen to it. So maybe there's a podcast in my future. Maybe I'll convince my new team that we should do a podcast. If not, maybe I'll just go off by myself and make my own one.
That was going to be exactly my next question. So if it wasn't related to work and you could set up a podcast, what would it be?
I've always wanted to do one about books. I love reading, and there's probably so many book podcasts out there, but I could talk at length about books and the books that I read. And I'm not someone who can just read a book and be like, oh, that was just a fun story. I'm like, okay, so what did this chapter mean? Like, why did the characters do this? Like, why was this growth important? And I will dig into it. And sometimes I'm like, this was a bad book because I don't think there was any thought into like the development of this character. Like, I love a morally grey character, and I would love to dig into like the importance of morally grey and the importance of not expecting every single character you read to be absolutely perfect and make every single good decision. So I think I could talk at length on a podcast about that. But the issue is, would it be interesting to people? And that would be the question I would have to ask myself.
There's always a niche audience who will want to join in. Trust me. I think what I have learned in my many, many years is that you can be yourself. And I think there's a lot of instances where you'll listen to a podcast where people are talking from an expert perspective and they're afraid to let go and be themselves. You know, they have a corporate front and a corporate voice. And, you know, I've worked with, you know, some global businesses. You know, I've worked in those environments. I've seen there's a real change in the way that people now communicate. People are absolutely crying out for a personal connection. They're crying out to hear from and to speak to somebody who speaks their language and is very real and honest. I do think there's been a massive change, and I think that's a really refreshing thing to see.
Also, podcasts are difficult for some. The beginning, if you listen to my first episodes, the reason why I said I wasn't a great host on the first one is because I was a lot more stressed and I was going very formal. I'm not naturally a formal person, but you can't help it. You're being recorded, and even though we don't release the full recording of it, you're still like, you're on camera, you're on mic, and you accidentally sort of move into that space of being like, oh, I need to be formal, oh, I'm representing someone, I have a responsibility here. And it did take me a few episodes to relax into my normal personality. So I have a lot of sympathy for guests who come on and if it's their first ever podcast, they're like, what? There is that element of like, I am here and I'm representing something. And I think also there's an element, they have like a commitment to their role and their work, and they're like, I need this to come across well, I need to represent it well. But I've had others who it's just been the best time, they've just been really chatty, and sometimes it's the recording has gone on for far too long and I feel very apologetic to the editor who then has to get that down into a reasonable time for a podcast. So there is like a very big variation in the guests and how it goes, and like sometimes I try and have like a pre-call with people to get to know me, but sometimes you just can't do that with busy people. So the first time they're meeting me is on camera, which is very difficult. It's why I thought you would be very good at stepping into this role, because you're also very personable, very friendly, very chatty, and I think you can help make people comfortable, because that's probably the hardest role of a host that you don't really think about. Such a wide variety of people with such different skills, and sometimes like the very technical people, trying to get them to chat outside of the technical can be quite tricky. They're coming on the podcast because they want to talk about their topic. Don't always know if I've achieved it, but I have had a lot of fun trying. So, is there anything else you want to ask, or anything you haven't spoken about yet that you would like to when it comes to you taking over as host?
I don't think so. I think I'm just looking forward to a new experience. I think what you've done with this podcast is a brilliant thing, and such a great legacy to leave for the project as well, for people to be able to dig back into it and to hear different perspectives. I mean, this won't really date, I suppose, either, will it? I mean, that information will always be pertinent, you know, that learning will always be there. So I think that's a really lovely, lovely thing. So no, I just hope I do it justice for you, Katie, and I hope that when you tune in every time, which of course you will, when you listen in future, I hope you think, oh, that's interesting, this is going well. Thank you for all the work that you've put into it, and for trusting us with it as well. I mean, you know, it's your baby.
Yeah, it did feel a bit like that. It's bittersweet to be leaving, but I am very, very sure that you're going to do a great job, and I will be tuning in. I'll have my Spotify notifications set up. So, Helen, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for listening to Groundwater Rising. Please hit the subscribe button on your podcast provider, leave us a review, and tell your friends and colleagues about us. Do you have a topic you'd like us to focus on Groundwater Rising, or would you like to share your personal groundwater flood story? Please email me on groundwaterrising@projectgroundwater.co.uk. That's all for now. We will be back on the last Thursday of next month with another episode of Groundwater Rising.